Good evening. Hidden Histories, St Mary's Glyntaff Churchyard, or Stories from the Stones. The talk this evening is structured the church itself, the architect, the churchyard. We'll have a tour of the churchyard, look at some of the gravestones and memorials, a little bit about monument symbolism and their meaning, because that's quite important with Victorian gravestones. Then we have a section on gathering the evidence, to try and get some biographies of the people buried in the churchyard that we've looked at. These will include looking at inscriptions, burial registers, family history research, census returns, contemporary newspaper reports, and obituary reports. And then we'll have a look at 33 people who are actually buried in St Mary's Churchyard, and then we'll look at a conclusion at the end. I first got involved with St Mary's Church in 2018. I'm a lapsed chapel boy myself, but there we are. I got involved with the church at St Mary's with Lest We Forget, which is a booklet produced to commemorate the 29 people who lost their lives in the First World War. I did some of the background history associated with that. And then in 2020, another book was published on St Mary's 180 to celebrate its 180th anniversary. And this provided the genesis of the hidden history book we have talked about tonight, because in that we identified a number of people in the churchyard who had a significant role in the evolution of Pontypridd. And then, of course, we have the hidden histories, which we talk about tonight. So the church has had 3 books published in the last few years, which is quite unique, I think. You know, most churches get 1 or perhaps 2, but to have 3 done in the space of about 3 years is remarkable, really, and quite unusual. A little bit about St Mary's Church itself. It was opened in 1838 and consecrated by the Archbishop of Glyntaff in 1839. It's quite a unique style for the area. There's not another one like it, certainly in Southeast Wales. It's a barn of a place. It's a big church, designed for the maximum number of people to be accommodated. Could be 1,000 worshippers, with an upstairs story as well, similar to what we see in many of the chapels. So it is a big barn of a place. Originally, of course, it had a pyramidal roof. These are 2 other views. The top left-hand one is from Pentrabarn Road, showing its pyramidal roof, and the other one is from the back where the railway line used to run. And you can see the short, shallow pyramidal roof with a weather vane on, which of course was blown down in 1913 in the tornado which hit South Wales. Inside, there's not a lot of decoration, but it has got a wonderful wooden rood screen between the church pews and the altar, which is a lovely piece of work. But the decoration is quite plain, except for a few stained glass windows. The architect was Thomas Henry Wyatt, an Irishman, a family of architects. Probably Thomas Digby Wyatt, his brother, was more well known than him, more famous architect than him. But he was a very competent and able architect. He designed St Mary's Church in the Italian Romanesque style, which is very unusual. Most Victorian churches are in the Gothic style, like St Catherine, for instance, Pontypridd. So the style is very, very different from the norm. His best ecclesiastical building is undoubtedly St Mary's and St Nicholas Church in Wilton, just outside Salisbury in Wiltshire, which is very similar in some respects to St Mary's, but far grander. It was designed for 2 or 3 years after St Mary's, but cost 4 times the price, hence the more ornate and ornamentation that you see there. The churchyard, we'll have a look around the churchyard. There are over 20,000 burial grounds in England and Wales, ranging from medieval churchyards to large Victorian cemeteries like Glyntaff, spanning different cultures, religions and centuries. The churchyard of St Mary's, like all burial places in the Anglican Church in Wales, was somewhere every person residing in the parish had a right by law to be buried in. The churchyard is not just a community of the dead, it's a thoughtful place reflecting the impact of time on humankind and our efforts to escape oblivion. It's an expression of history full of personal and community stories. The churchyard is a window into a past way of life, a place where different human concerns meet. Sadness, of course, is there all the time. Loss, history, tragedy, and unfortunately we have a few of those commemorated in St Mary's. And of course, uncertainty for the future. The churchyard is a space charged with emotion, and it provides a special place for quiet reflection and contemplation also. There is always the chance of random discovery, the opportunity to be surprised by something beautiful or interesting. And this is a prime example of that. You go in the main entrance by the church, go round the corner, and you gaze and see this obelisk in the near distance there. And if you haven't seen it before, it's quite surprising, to say the least, and unusual. As well as being a place for people, the churchyard's grounds are also a haven for nature, such as trees. We have some wonderful, almost 200-year-old yew trees within the graveyard. Some wildflower, particularly in springtime, primroses and daffodils, and of course habitats for wildlife. I've been scrabbling around the graves, taking photographs, trying to read inscriptions, and I've seen the odd cat, a couple of mice, a couple of field mice, and this cheeky little chappy here, a little robin, perched just above my head, and I'm looking at this particular grave there. So there are havens for wildlife as well. Sorrow is always present, of course, but age and weather have tempered that. St Mary's Church and Churchyard encapsulates the diverse history of the community, all in an attractive setting, like no other place in the historic built environment of the area. When I was doing the identifying the graves and where they were, it was obvious we needed to draw up a grid plan. There wasn't a grid plan for the churchyard, so I drew this up, delineated by Gregor Halbert on the right-hand side there. The bottom half of the site there, part of the cemetery was actually lost when they built the A470 trunk road and they realigned Pentrabach roads. So the bottom half of the site was actually lost. The church, and of course the pathways shown with the dotted lines there, delineate where you are within the churchyard. It's a simple grid with numbers and lettering on the side. So it could be D1, C3 or whatever. And each of the graveyards we've identified and put in the book, we've actually numbered their actual location. The memorials in a modern burial ground tend to be relatively small and very similar in style. This is a result, of course, of modern conservative rules, reflected maintenance and conformity consideration and a desire to limit the cost and today's view of what is tasteful, of course, which is very different from Victorian times. The Victorians, or at least the better off ones, were not so constrained by these, so that memorials come in all shapes and sizes, many of which can be found in St Mary's Churchyard. Now we'll look at some graveyards and memorials. There's a huge, wonderful variety of gravestones and memorials in the churchyard. Victorian graves tended to be much more elaborate than modern graves. And there's a few examples there of memorials there, gravestone, chest tomb, table tomb, crosses, all sorts. It was expected, of course, that families would spend as much as it could afford on a monument appropriate to the deceased and, of course, the family's social status. Took great pride in spending money on some of these memorials, which must have been really expensive at the time. Whilst others, of course, are more humble, which is a simple headstone with very little on them at all. Two of the memorials there are absolutely stunning. They're both grade 2 listed in their own right, and we'll talk about those two in a moment. A little bit about monument symbolism, because Victorian graves are much more elaborate than modern graves. But what a Victorian family chose to put on a monument was never a mistake. Rather, the Victorian was somewhat fixated on symbolism, because gravestones were expensive and space was at a premium. This unique expression was often accomplished through the use of symbolism that other members of society would recognize, of course. Whilst many of these symbols are fairly simple interpretations, others are more difficult to determine today. Here are just a few examples, and we'll talk briefly about them, because they appear in many of the graves within St. Mary's. It's a huge subject in its own right, and there are literally hundreds of these different symbols. So we'll just talk briefly about some of the ones that appear in St. Mary's. The canter sleeve, common motif seen on the edges of headstone, it symbolizes the immortality of the soul. An anchor or an anchor and train symbolizes faith in salvation. Angels appear in many forms, but are symbolic messages between God and man. A book normally refers to the Bible, but also refers to the book of life. And it symbolizes faithfulness. Circles again come in many shapes and forms. Sometimes they're shown as a snake eating its tail or as a wheel. And they were sometimes depicted. And their broken wheel symbolizes the end of someone's life and symbolizes faithfulness. Crosses again come in many forms, from simple Latin crosses to a Christian symbol of faith, of course. Celtic crosses are much more elaborate than the normal crosses. Dove, this appears and represents love, peace, and the freedom of someone's spirit. It's also a Christian symbol of the Holy Spirit. Hands, these appear in all sorts of different ways, from a handshake, hand pointing up, hand pointing down, cusp hand, praying hand, and they all have individual meanings and symbols. IHS, or sometimes written as IHC, represent the Greek contraction of Jesus, sometimes regarded as an abbreviation of a Latin phrase, Jesus, Saviour of man. A laurel leaf represents life's achievement. It can represent victory, distinction, eternity, or indeed immortality. RIP, simple RIP see on gravestones, is an abbreviation of the Latin requiescat in pace, or in English, rest in peace. Quatrefoils, these appear in different forms. 4 circles that partly overlap to form a cross, and they symbolize the 4 apostles. A torch burning, it represents eternal light. Inverted or extinguished, it symbolizes death. An urn, again, harks back to the scenery urns of antiquity, sometimes shown as an urn draped with a drape over it. These are usually have a through which the spirit can escape. The drape represents mourning and also the soul. Some graves have a weeping figure, a general display of grief and mourning, of course. And a weeping willow, the drooping branch of the tree, a visual representation of sorrow or mourning. So that's a pretty quick resume of some of the symbols that are on some of the graves in St. Mary's. But it's a whole new study in itself. St. Mary's Churchyard is a tangible link to the past. where the past is close enough to touch. By using the inscriptions on its gravestones and memorials, it can provide the essential key in unlocking a treasure trove of information. So, inscriptions are the first things that we can look at. They appear in all sorts of different ways on many of the memorials. However, it can be some problematical, but inscriptions on some of the gravestones vary enormously from both the content or indeed the lack of it, and of course the legibility due to age, weather and erosion. There's 3 examples here to give you an idea of what I mean. The one on the left, although it's a very old grave, it's 150 years old, flush with the ground, it is nevertheless in really good condition, and you can see the inscription on it very plainly indeed. Sir Thomas Fowler, we'll talk about him in a moment, but there's a wealth of information where he was born, where he lived, his occupation, and where he worked, etc. Then you have very small ones with just the initial on and maybe the date as well. Most of these are very illegible. You can't even see them. The one on the right is a wonderful grave of an angel taking a child to heaven. It's obviously a gravestone for a child, but the inscription on the base of the memorial there is totally illegible. It's been worn away with the weather and age. So they do vary enormously. Some really good, some pretty poor. The next thing to look at, of course, is burial registers. There are 3 burial registers covering the period 1848 to 2002. There are a total of 2,161 burials recorded in these registers, including 19 burials of cremated remains. Fortunately, they survived, and they're now held in the Morgan archives. The registers themselves don't show an awful lot, really. They record the name, the abode where they lived, the date they were buried, their age, and who was the officiating at the ceremony of the burial. That's all you get. You don't get where they buried or anything like that, or the location. Those just 5 simple things like that. Family history, of course, is another good way of finding out information about individuals. These are 2 marriage certificates, one from Richard Rowland, we're talking at the moment, and Mary King at San Juan. And interestingly, he was a coal owner, and the marriage ceremony was witnessed by another coal owner, John Calvert. We'll meet him later on now as we go through. The second one there is the marriage of Joseph Eugene Achille and Mary Diana Spencer at Odessa in the Ukraine, Tsarist Russia at the time. And we'll see them in a moment. And of course, the census returns. We've looked at the census returns from 1841 up until 1911. Of course, 1921 one has just recently been released. And they're often a good source of information on where people live and who the rest of the family are. And again, there's newspaper articles. The National Library of Wales has most of the newspaper articles in its database, and you can search them. They're always a good source of information again, particularly for the obituaries, because they record lots of detail about the individuals. So who's interned at St. Mary's Churchyard? Well, there are movers and shakers of all kinds, including arts, druids, bards, brewers, clergy, clockmakers, colliery proprietors, industrialists, licensees, maltsters and millers, musicians and performers, mystics, politicians, philanthropists, poor law guardians, quarry owners, theatre proprietors, and many more besides, who have all helped shape the community of Pontypridd in its formative years. There are tales of great fortitude and human endeavour and enterprise, strong characters, shrewd business acumen, pioneering spirit, fortunes won and lost, philanthropy, social enterprise, success and kindness, and much more beside. So let's go through the grade 2 listed dates into St. Mary's Churchyard and look at some of them. The obelisk shown here is for Richard, the son of Richard Crawshay, 1840, son of Francis Crawshay, sorry, who died just about a year-old infant. Infant mortality in Victorian times was quite high, as is testament to lots of the graves in St. Mary's are for children. Because disease, of course, is much more prevalent in Victorian times than it is now. It's an unusual grave to say the least. It's an obelisk of a style found in Egypt. His father, Francis Crawshay, was a bit of an eccentric and a bit of a character, and a contemporary and colleague of Dr. William Price. So he didn't want any old gravestones to commemorate his infant son. He put this obelisk up. Of course, at the time, in the mid-19th century, obelisk was seen as pagan. The only reason apparently he got his way is right at the bottom, just on the right-hand side there, you can see in very small text, he's put the term, "Suffer little children to come unto me," which is a biblical text. And apparently that swayed the authorities to let the obelisk stay in the church. But it's certainly striking. It's been struck by lightning a couple of times, and look at it, it's been split and repaired. Stands about 3 meters tall. Quite stunning, quite surprising when you turn around the corner from the church and you see it in the distance. But later on in the 19th century, obelisks started to appear in gravestones, and they're much more acceptable. At the time of year when this was done, pre-1850, this was seen as a pagan symbol. Elizabeth Miles, she's a remarkable woman. She's born in Treforest. Her parents run a pub there. She's one of 14 children, many of whom died in infancy. She got married, and by the time she was 24, she was widowed, with a son, 1 year old, and another son, almost two months old. So she had 2 young children, desperately facing the world. So what did she do? She turned to the pub game, licensed trade, which she knew best, having grown up in a licensed trade environment with a family. She became very successful at it and ran a few pubs. Then she ran the New Inn Hotel and bought the New Inn Hotel. She also bought the Angel in Cardiff, another hotel in Caerphilly, and a hotel in Swansea. So she became quite a renowned hotelier. Then she bought Bridge Hotel in Sandrin of Wales. She bought at auction a number of hotel equipment, such as plates, ornaments, linen, all with the letter M on. She must have had a good deal with them, obviously. Got back to the Bridge Hotel, where it was pointed out that her sons were grown up by this time. Why have you bought this, man? You've got M on everything, the carpet, on everything you bought. But she said, from now on, we're going to call the Bridge Hotel the Hotel Metropole. And so it is to this day. And her family still run it over 120 years later. But even though she was very successful, her heart was still with Treforest. And she got buried in St Mary's, with a grand gravestone there, along with the two sons, overlooking her birthplace. Watkins Spencer was one of her surviving elder brothers. He'd worked in Treforest Iron Company and secured a job as manager of the rail mills for this Yekaterinoslav iron and steel works in Ukraine, in what of course was then Tsarist Russia. Not too far from where John Hughes was working, at Donetsk. So there you are, not just one boy from the Taff Field living in Tsarist Russia in the 19th century, but two, John Hughes and Watkins Spencer. It's unknown whether they knew each other, but it's possible, of course. He must have enjoyed a decent life there, with lots of servants. His daughter married a Frenchman who also worked in the works in Odessa, on the Black Sea in Ukraine. But later on in life, he suffered a stroke. So he wanted to go home, ostensibly to die. His wife and his daughter accompanied him, and he made a long journey all across Europe to get home to his sister, Elizabeth Miles, who at the time lived in the Grange. He survived the journey. God managed to get home, but within a few days, unfortunately, he died. I think he is buried there, not far from his sister in St Mary's. John Calvert, Yorkshireman, born in Kettlewell, originally worked with Robert and George Stevenson on a railway line near Birmingham. He must have had the approbation of the two engineers, because they were quite impressed with what he was doing and his standard of work. And they said to him, why don't you have a go and put your tender in for the contract for a clever little line that Isabel Kingdom Brunel is building down in South Wales, which was, of course, the Taff Vale Railway. He was fortunately with his contract. He had most of the contract, building of the Taff Vale Railway from Llandaff to Merthyr Tydfil, which he successfully completed, his Taff Vale Railway. He also built the Llancair branch over to Nelson on the Taff Vale Railway. And then he started prospecting for coal in the area, because the coal measures were starting being open. So he thought he'd have a go at that as well. He'd accrued some money as well. He sank the Gefechten colliery in Pontypridd, and struck on the coal seam there, on the number 3 coal seam, and then celebrated that with a huge marquee and a crowd and roasted an ox as well. He was a very generous man with his money, but unfortunately, like everything else, it all came to a sad end. He lost a lot of his money, making unsound investments and all those. But at one time, he was a member of the Pontypridd Burial Board, he was a member of the Pontypridd Markets Company, member of the Pontypridd Gas and Light Company, a very prominent businessman. So he died a pauper at the end of the day in a little cottage in Llangollen. Big fall from grace, and formerly lived in Getty Wastad House. Richard Robbins Rowland, another person that came to the area from the southwest. He sent the Newbridge and Rhondda collieries. He went into a contract with Richard Fothergill for all the coal that he was being mined to supply the Taff Vale ironworks. The contract was for a number of years, where the price didn't vary. And of course, the coal prices went up, and he lost a lot of money. And in the end, he came out of the business altogether. But I mentioned earlier about he was married in Llanwyddo, and John Calvert, the other quarrel we just talked about, he was the witness. So they obviously knew each other, because they're in the same club, obviously. And again, he's buried there in St. Mary's in quite a grand grave, cross on the top of a hip grave. Thomas Fowler, yet another coal proprietor. He was originally a contractor for the maintenance of the Taffrail Railway. But for some reason or other, he fell out with the company and he was paid off. And then he thought he had some money. So he invested in taking some collieries in the early days. And he took the Maritime Colliery. Doing very well there. Formed a couple of companies, Thomas Fowler and Brothers, Great Western and Fowler's United Coal Company, and Fowler's Pond Creek Steam Coal Company. He was very successful. Again, he lived in Gethley Orsted House. All the great and the good, if they were really wealthy, tended to live in Gethley Orsted House. He didn't live there, didn't buy the place, because that was still owned by the Thomas family. But that's the place they lived. He, again, like most of the people, took public office. He was a member of the Board of Guardians for Pontypridd Coal Law Union. So the three of them have got a connection. John Calvert owned the New Ridge Colliery from 1844. Thomas Fowler owned it from 1869. And Richard Robbins Rowland from the mid-1900s. And the engine of the New Ridge Colliery fortunately survives and is now in the grounds of the University of South Wales. So there's a nice link between the three coal proprietors with the engine, really. That's all that's left. John Thomas, or Ian D, his bardic name, born in West Wales. He started off as a clerk for the Chartist leader, Ebenezer Williams, over in Gwent. He did a great service to Wales when he put together the Cambrian minstrel. What he did was travel around Marvin and Carmarthenshire, writing down and collecting all the Welsh airs that were handed down from father to son or daughter, which hadn't been written down. So he wrote down the music and the words and put them all together in the Cambrian minstrel. And if he hadn't done that, a lot of these Welsh airs would have been lost. In total, there were 104 Welsh airs, and 43 of those were composed by him himself. He's also credited with organising the first Handel's Messiah in 1840 in Wales, to be sung in Wales. He was a choir master, exemplary choir master, very successful music teacher, and all his choirs were preeminent in the Crystal Palace competitions in the 1870s. He has a magnificent grave, it's a grade 2 listed one, lots of Celtic cross emblems and things there, and some dedications by Welsh poets and things. A really striking piece of work. Elizabeth Phillips, Marvin Glyntaff. She was born in Treforest in Cardiff. With her husband, she lived in above the bridge in Treforest. She had a lovely soprano voice at the time, before the National Eisteddfod, about the Abergavenny Eisteddfod was the preeminent musical competition Eisteddfod in Wales. She won there several times under the direction and trained by Ian Lee, John Thomas, the one we just talked about. The Abergavenny Eisteddfod, of course, supported by Lady Llanover, who was supportive of all things Welsh. She died, unfortunately, quite young, aged only 48, of TB, which of course was prevalent at the time. All the children, all 7 children, all emigrated to America. One of her daughters was known as the Welsh Nightingale for her singing prowess, so she followed her mother's example there. And another one became a very famous chef. But her gravestone says nothing at all about her musical abilities at all. Just records her name and the date of her birth and death, and that's it, which is a great shame. Evan Davis, he was a surgeon and doctor. He was a doctor for the Wesleyan and General Insurance Company, of course, the non-national health then. You had to be a member of an insurance society, and he'd come up and visit him, and administer general practitioner and things like that. He was also the doctor for the southern part of the Merthyr Tydfil Poor Law Union, and he was also the doctor for Brown Reynolds Chainworks, having taken over after Dr. William Price. He was also chairman of the Victoria Bridge Building Committee, which opened the new bridge, Victoria Bridge, in 1856. It must have been quite a character, because at the time, Pontypridd was full of strong characters. But anyway, he was the chair of this and successfully guided the process of school. He is commemorated as well in a stained glass window in St. Mary's, and he has a lovely grave with a draped urn on the pedestal there. A really striking memorial. Evan Davis, Marva Morgano. Again, this is a real character. Born in Churchyard near Bridgend, came to Pontypridd as a clockmaker. The clock you see there is still in Pontypridd Museum, at the back there by the side of the organ. Still working, still in good condition, made by him. He was a real character. He was responsible for carrying out the erection of the circle of stones around the rocking stone called the Serpent. He became Archsteward of Halbert and then Archsteward of Britain. A role he was in competition with Dr. William Price. They didn't get on at all. They were fierce rivals. He started off as a nonconformist minister, but then he kind of disenchanted with Christianity, calling it Christianity in a Jewish garb. So he didn't get on with the local clergy at all, and I think the clergy reciprocated that thing as well. But he was guiding light, no question about that, about the promotion of Druidism in Pontypridd, a real hotbed for Druidism, with ceremonies taking place in the town and of course on the common around the Brockenstone. He was a real character, very intelligent man, although he had no formal education. He wrote lots of books, quite esoteric to say the least, some of them, all in Welsh. Fortunately, about 11 of them still survive, some are in the Pontypridd Library, but most are in Cardiff Library or the National Library of Wales. Now, we couldn't find his grave. We've looked and looked and looked. We know he's buried there. Marvin, the old Williams, the Western Mail reporter, extensive reported on him. We tried if we might, we couldn't find his grave. His wife was buried there about 20 years before him. Again, we could find no trace of it. It seems likely that it was a very small headstone. Towards the latter part of his life, he was financially supported by the Marquis of Phillips, who again was a bit of an odd character, and they obviously shared some learnings to do with that. William Jones and Tom Jones? No, not that Tom Jones, different. William Jones kept the original Clarence Hotel on the corner there, which was redone, of course, in 1912, revamped later on. Tom Jones's son kept the Royal Clarence Theatre, and of course the theatre was very popular in Pontypridd as in other places before the advent of the cinema, of course. The pub, the original Clarence Hotel, had a troop of monkeys in it who kept chattering until they were finally inebriated by all the customers in the bar, and they put them all to sleep to stop them chattering. All that area, of course, now is all gone. All been demolished last year. George William Lennox, born in Tottenham in London, known as the father of the Welsh chain trade. He was the son of Samuel Lennox, co-founder with Captain Samuel Brown of the Brown Lennox Company. On the death of Samuel Brown, he came to Pontypridd to take over the running of the Brown Lennox Works, established in 1818. Under his direction, the Brown Lennox Works prospered, so much so that our good friend Isabel Kingdom Brunel visited the works on a number of occasions, and at the launch of the Great Eastern in 1858, he asked George Lennox, "Come and stand with me to get a photograph taken." George William Lennox declined. So apparently the noted engineer Brunel then scribbled on the back, "I alone am hung in chains." And then here's the famous Robert Halbert photograph. He lived in Pontypridd in St. Harold House part of the year and partly in London. His gravestone there was got a quatrefoil in the centre and 4 little candle holders holding candle with crocketed shoulders on the grave. His wife owns the Rosa Lennox, the Cornish girl who became one of the best loved women in Wales. She supported her husband, and they lived in St. Harold House. They're shown there, where the park is now, of course. House was demolished to make way for the A470, but she was very supportive of her workforce, of her widows and children, people who had worked in the Brown Lennox thing. She was very well respected and very well loved. The family donated a lectern to commemorate George and Rosa Lennox in St. Mary's Church, and they're still there. Philip Thomas, born in Drumai near Nice, met Samuel Brown in London. He was working there. We don't realise a lot of Brown Lennox works, particularly up until about 1850, was in connection with the building of suspension bridges. Philip Thomas was the clerk of the works, he was like head engineer on the building of Brighton Chain Pier, which was demolished then in December 1895 with a huge gale. But he was also a co-patentee with Samuel Brown for some of the patents to do with associated with chains. He's buried in is commemorated in his wife's, in his daughter's gravestone at St. Mary's. The original gravestone you can see there is now on the common. There's a bit of a tale involved with that as well. Let me read it to you. Stranger halts and Churchyard to commemorate the virtuous abilities of Philip Thomas was there, who after managing the chain work on the right-hand side for the space of 21 years, much to the benefit of all mankind, died and was buried herein. Allegedly, the stonemason was a Welsh vicar, and of course he didn't have the right way of doing that. And of course, the family took offence at it, and the stone was actually removed. It's a huge stone, and you can just about see it now up on the common in Pontypridd house there. George James Penn, born in London, again, worked in Brown Lennox in their London works, was invited down to Pontypridd to work in the Pontypridd works. He managed the works for 40 years. He worked in there for 40 years. He also lived in Halbert, a prominent church warden as well in St. Mary's Church. Again, another one that became a member of the Pontypridd Poor Law Union, as did most of them. James Allen, now he was an inspector, born in London again, came down to work in Brown Lennox Pontypridd train works. He was an inspector of trains in Brown Lennox. Then he left. He was presented with a silver snuff box by his colleagues when he left the works for his good service. For some reason or other, he seems to have gone to Australia. And you think, oh, why are you going to Australia? Well, there, we found him on the Bonaccord, which is a small clipper ship. And he signed on board there on the ship's manifest as a seaman, an ordinary seaman, which is the lowest of the low. So any sailing, up to sail, you want to go, whatever, you know, the lowest of the low. And he was the oldest person on board as well, 48. Quite know how, what he did, we don't even know. And the next time we come across him, he's in as an inmate in Darlinghurst Jail in Sydney. Quite know what he did there in Australia, maybe just like a big, don't know. However, he came back to the UK and had a job with Brown Lennox again in their proving house and their train testing facility in Cardiff Docks. He was obviously well respected by his employers, with workmen, because they paid for the actual memorial to be erected. John Salton Maddox, he's born in Totnes area there. He worked on the South Devon Railway as a stonemason for Brunel's atmospheric railway. Then he came to South Wales to try his luck here, and then became the owner of the Pentrabarth Quarry, just off Pentrabarth Road there. Had a contract to supply stone via the Glamorganshire Canal, which you can just see just under that bridge at the time, supplying stone for the building of Cardiff Docks. Again, he became a member of Pontypridd Poor Law Union, and a member of the Board of Guardians. Quite a lot of the gentlemen we talked to seem to have done that. If you're expected, if you were a pillar of the business community in order to take some sort of public office as well, and most of them did. So there he is, he's born again. He shipped huge quantities of stone via the canal down to Cardiff. The Grover sisters, Letitia Jean, Catherine and Mary Ann, three of them never married, all lived together. The Grover family generally, a wealthy family, own lots of land all around, and business interests all around the thing. Letitia Jean, the eldest one, she's also commemorated one of the commemorative windows in St. Mary's Church as well. Ebenezer Williams, He was a big compatriot of Dr. William Price and supported the building of a tower that was going to be built on the Pontypridd Common, which unfortunately didn't get built. He was on the building committee as well for the Victoria Bridge in 1856. He was a well-known maltster within Pontypridd. There were 3 maltsters in Pontypridd at the time. His malting business was cut by Edwin Terrace, almost opposite where the Maltsters Arms are. And the smell must have wafted all over Pontypridd, and the wind was in the right direction. His son, Captain William Williams, Justice of the Peace, he lived in Danacoid House, where the YMCA is now on top of Taff Street. In 1838, he set up the Pontypridd Brewery, which is the oldest brewery in Pontypridd, in what is now Boots the Chemist in Taff Street, overlooking the river there. The oldest brewery in Pontypridd, and the last one to close. He became a captain in the Rifle Volunteers, who were like a form of territorial army, reservists. Became a captain in that. In 1875, he became one of the founder members of the Merlin Lodge in Pontypridd. In 1892, the brewery, his former Pontypridd brewery, was taken over to form the larger Rhondda Valley Celebrated Ales brewery. In 1887, he built the Merlin Hotel in Pultgwain. The reasons why he built the hotel, quite unknown, really. The area was being developed for new housing for workers coming into the area to develop the coal mining, deep seam coal mining. However, it took him 2 years to get a license to open the building. There was lots of opposition from the Temperance Society and also the directors of the nearby Great Western Colliery. But he got there in the end and he did open it. But the connection with the Merlin, I suppose, is like a neon sign today. You put something there, you put figure of Merlin on above the main entrance, that would attract customers from far and wide. Again, quite a significant man about the town, very successful businessman. First 4 vicars, well, they're all buried in St. Mary's. The first one wasn't appointed until 1848. Before that time, the vicar of Eglwys would ride over the mountain to hold services in St. Mary's Church. So he was covering St. Mary's as well as St. Istyn at the top of the mountain there. But 1848, they first had their own vicar, Reverend John Graves, born in West Wales. But they didn't have a vicarage. So the first thing he had to campaign about was to try and raise funds to build a vicarage. Lots of local worthies and landowners giving money, Bishop of Llandaff and various other people. They built the vicarage there. He has a very ornate grave. It's still got his railings around it as well, which is quite a survivor. These days, got a lot of those were taken down during the war, for the war effort. So that one must seem to have escaped. Second vicar, Reverend William Watkins. He was vicar for only 3 years. He did work in Llandovery College. His wife died, and he left then the St. Mary's and ended up in Bideford, where he had his living in a hotel. And unfortunately, his body was found at the bottom of Ford Rock in Bideford. and the verdict was accidental death. Very tragic. So although he's buried at Bideford, he's commemorated in the same grave as his wife. The Reverend Samuel Rowland Jones, Vicar from 1878 to 1905. He was chair of the Pontypridd Burial Board up to 1871, and the school board. He was also a Welsh scholar and wrote periodicals, articles for the periodical San, which is the Welsh language publication for the Church in Wales. He left his employ as a vicar when his eyesight became bad, and he died at his daughter's home in Triga. The Reverend Gower Jones, born in Llanelli, St Mary's longest serving vicar. Very active, reforming the church, very active with the Sunday school. The picture there of the vicarage without the roof, that was part of the tornado of 1913. And his wife is surveying the damage, and I can just about see that. He also served as a padre in the First World War, and died at his home in Cardiff. 5 victims of the Great Western Colliery disaster also buried in St Mary's. 5 of the 63 lives were lost in the fire. Charles Cavill, age 50, Thomas Lambert, age 22, William Wheeler, age 20, William Bowers, age 22, and George C. Lewis, age just 15. The inquest, well, that was held in the New Inn Hotel in Pontypridd, and not surprisingly, no blame was attributed to any of the officials, either before or after the accident. So what are your thoughts on entering a burial ground? Death and grieving, perhaps? Well, there is another view, seeing them as rich resources of history and heritage, beauty, places brimming with wildlife, and also as interesting places to visit. Stepping into a churchyard like St Mary's Glyntaff can feel like stepping back in time, into a place of quiet reflection, a habitat of plants, animal species, and a space full of historical significance. Churchyards are rarely locked, meaning they are treasure troves of local, regional, and sometimes nationally important heritage, which can be explored by anyone at any one time. However, their heritage value and even their continuing presence cannot be taken for granted. They are sometimes under threat from development, closure, undermanagement, and of course, mismanagement. Hopefully, this presentation and book will raise the profile of the rich heritage resource at St Mary's Churchyard to a wider audience. Many of the people interned at St Mary's Churchyard have been helped shape the community of Pontypridd during its formative years, making it the vibrant town we know today. Through personal endeavour and enterprise, often against the odds, like women working in basically a man's world, they have prevailed, and we should not forget them and the contribution they have made to the town. The churchyard at St Mary's Churchyard, Glyntaff, encapsulates the diverse history of the community, like no other place in the historic built environment in the area, and provides a real shop window into the past. The hidden histories and the stories from the stones bring some of that intriguing history of Pontypridd in its formative years to light. I hope you have enjoyed the hidden history of St Mary's Churchyard, Glyntaff, and its stories from the stones. Copies of the book are available from Pontypridd Library in Taff Street, Storyville Books in Middle Street, both in Pontypridd, of course, and via me at the email address shown there. price at 14.49. Thank you very much.